I was in primary school when this happened, living with my family in a detached house on the outskirts of Trondheim, Norway. Winters there are pretty severe, with consistent snow cover and temperatures commonly below 10 degrees Celsius. That environmental context, it's pretty important because it made certain aspects of this situation objectively really abnormal. So at the time I was 9 years old, and on that evening I was in the bathroom with my older sister while she trimmed our dog's nails. My father was in the living room, and my younger brother, who was a toddler, was moving between rooms as he usually did. The house was otherwise quiet though. The doorbell rang unexpectedly that day. As a child, I had a habit of running to answer the door before adults could even get there. There was no instruction from my parents to do this. It was just simply something that I did impulsively as a kid. And so I left the bathroom and went directly to the front entrance. When I opened the door, I saw a girl standing on the step. She appeared to be between roughly 11 and 14 years old, I would say. Her clothing immediately stood out, though, because it was not appropriate for the weather conditions. She was wearing a thin pink zip-up hoodie and a short skirt. Most notably, too, she had no shoes on. She was wearing only socks, which were soaked through and visibly dirty from snow and slush. Given the outside temperature as well, this alone indicated that she had been outside for at least some time. She spoke immediately after the door opened, though, but I didn't fully understand what she was saying. Her speech was rapid and somewhat disorganized. I could not determine whether she was asking for a specific person or trying to describe a situation or something. Because I did not know how to respond, I turned and I went to get my father. He was already moving toward the entrance after hearing the doorbell and my voice. We returned to the doorway together within only a few seconds. And during that brief interval, something had already changed. My younger brother had walked toward the open door out of curiosity, and the girl had suddenly picked him up. She was holding him against her body, not aggressively but firmly enough that he couldn't move away on his own. My father immediately asked me whether I knew her, and I told him that I didn't. At this point, his posture changed from neutral to defensive. He approached and attempted to take my brother back, but the girl resisted. She didn't strike or push or anything, but she tightened her hold and turned her body away from him, as if preparing to leave while carrying my brother. My father then used physical force to remove the child from her arms, and he succeeded within a few seconds. Once my brother was no longer in her possession, her behavior, though, shifted significantly. She began crying and speaking loudly and really incoherently. She repeatedly mentioned a name which none of us recognized. She also made statements indicating that she believed that somebody was in danger or that she needed to find that person immediately or something. Some of what she said sounded threatening, but it was unclear whether those were directed threats or just expressions of panic or whatever. My father, though, attempted to calm her down and ask some basic questions such as, well, where she lived and whether she needed some help. She did not respond in a structured way, though. Instead, she abruptly sort of turned and just ran away from the property toward the street. I was then instructed to leave the entryway and stay with my sister. I did not witness what happened immediately afterward, but my father later contacted emergency services, and several hours later, I was told that authorities had located the girl in a nearby cemetery, about 100 meters from our house, and she was reportedly found sitting in the snow without proper footwear and was transported by the ambulance for medical evaluation, and apparently she was in a pretty bad condition. No further details were shared with me at that time, likely due to my age, but the incident was not discussed within the household afterward, and so daily routines resumed normally within maybe a day or two. From my perspective now, though, I guess the most plausible explanation is that the girl was experiencing a sort of severe psychological or neurological breakdown or something, possibly combined with hypothermia. Her clothing, lack of footwear, disorganized speech, fixation on locating an unknown individual, and impaired judgment regarding personal boundaries Well, they all align with that interpretation for sure. However, one element remains notable. The speed with which she moved from standing at the door to physically holding my younger brother within a matter of, milliseconds. Well, that indicates that she had immediately assessed the environment and acted with clear intent. And even if her underlying mental state was compromised, that was troubling and, pretty threatening, to be honest. After that event, I never again opened the door to unknown visitors during childhood. That change for me was immediate and permanent. And even now, decades later, I still verify the identity of anyone at my door before unlocking it. And so, in all the places that I've stayed at or lived in, I insist that I install a peephole, at the very least. Before describing the incident, some context is necessary to understand why the situation escalated the way that it did. I'm a woman in my early 20s, living in Eastern Europe. I have a mobility-related disability and rely on a cane for balance. My income has been inconsistent for several years, which has forced me to move frequently between short-term housing arrangements. At the time of this incident, I was renting a room in a shared private residence rather than a formal apartment. The arrangement was informal but common locally. I rented a single room in a family-owned house where the owners also lived. The household consisted of 2 adults, their 2 children, and the husband's elderly aunt, who had limited mobility and rarely climbed stairs as well. The house, it had 2 levels to it, and I stayed in a converted room on the upper floor, near a laundry alcove and a small rooftop access door. Now, on the day that this occurred, everybody in the household left by mid-morning. The adults accompanied the elderly aunt to a medical appointment. It was across town, I think, and the children were taken elsewhere for the afternoon. I was informed ahead of time that I would be alone until early evening, so I knew that this was going on. The house was normally loud and pretty active, but once everybody left, the absence of the noise was pretty noticeable. This was not fear-inducing by itself, but it made every small sound very much stand out. I spent the first few hours just sort of applying for jobs and responding to emails and whatnot. Nothing unusual happening during that time. But shortly after noon, I heard someone call my name from the hallway outside of my room. The voice matched the elderly aunt's tone and accent precisely. She used the same shortened form of my name that she had used many times before, and the call sounded close, not distant or muffled by any means. My immediate assumption was that the family had returned, maybe earlier than expected. And while it was certainly unlikely, it was not impossible, but the aunt had climbed the stairs with assistance every other time that I'd seen her. I stood up and unlocked my door, and stepped into the hallway using my cane, but nobody was there. The upper floor was silent. There were no footsteps, no movement, and no sound coming from the stairwell. Given the aunt's physical condition as well, it would not have been possible for her to call out and then leave the area within seconds like that. I considered that I might have misheard something mechanical or maybe even external, and so I returned to my room and I closed the door. Less than a minute later, the voice came again. This time it came from the direction of the laundry area near the rooftop access as well, and the wording was identical. I responded verbally and moved toward the sound, assuming that if the aunt had fallen or needed help, delay would be dangerous. Before stepping fully into the laundry space, I closed my door behind me out of habit. But the laundry area was empty. The rooftop door was closed. There was no airflow or outside noise that would have produced a vocal imitation like this. The house, it remained locked from the inside as confirmed later, and as I stood there, a loud impact noise came from the lower floor. It sounded heavy, like an object striking the ground or maybe the wall or something. At that point, I returned to my room immediately, locked the door, and contacted the homeowner by phone. I asked if they had returned unexpectedly or sent anyone back to the house or something like that. I was told, though, that they were still at the clinic and had not authorized anyone to enter the property. I was also told that the doors had been locked when they had left. But while on the call, I heard the voice a third time, and so did the homeowner. It came from directly outside of my door. The tone, the pacing, and the volume, they were consistent with the previous calls. The wording was unchanged, and this time I didn't respond. I remained in my room for the rest of that afternoon. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but I had the persistent impression of someone standing in that hallway. I cannot attribute the feeling to any specific sensory input, but it just didn't subside until that family returned several hours later. When the homeowners came back, they confirmed that the loud noise, the one where I heard like somebody hitting the wall or whatever, had been caused by a wall-mounted clock detaching and falling in the living room. No one could explain, though, why it had fallen. I mean, the mounting hardware was pretty old, but it was sturdy as heck, so yeah, that was weird. No one had entered the house, and as far as I knew, no one had been upstairs. There were no further incidences during my stay there, and I moved out several weeks later for unrelated issues. In 2011, I was employed as a post-incident structural assessor, working alongside municipal emergency services in northern England. My role was not firefighting itself, but just sort of evaluating fire-damaged buildings for safety, origin indicators, and structural failure risks once suppression operations ended. Now, one night in late October, a large industrial fire broke out in a former textile complex near the edge of the city. The site consisted of 5 interconnected brick and timber warehouse buildings constructed between 1890 and 1915. They had been repurposed over the decades for storage and light manufacturing. Due to the outdated maintenance practices, many of the interior floors had been treated for years with petroleum-based sealants. And once ignition occurred, well, the fire spread rapidly through the wooden floor system. The alarm came in shortly after 1:30 in the morning. The fire crews worked until dawn, and the 2 structures were completely lost. A third partially collapsed, and the remaining buildings sustained heavy smoke and water damage. Thankfully, though, no civilian casualties were reported. By mid-afternoon the next day, I was on site with a small assessment team reviewing the integrity of the least damaged structure, which bordered the collapse section. During our briefing, a senior firefighter from one of the ladder companies approached us, and he stated that while checking for fire spread during the early stages of suppression, that he had heard repeated screaming coming from below ground level in that building. He believed that it originated from the lower sublevel. He explained that flooding from the suppression efforts had filled the lower floors with murky water, and visibility was nearly zero down there. He could not descend safely at the time and assumed that the sounds were either mechanical or stress-related. Still, though, the clarity of the sound bothered him enough to mention it. The following morning, once water levels had receded a little bit, I volunteered to inspect the lower levels. I entered alone, carrying a helmet-mounted lamp and a handheld torch. No one accompanied me due to safety constraints and limited access, but what appeared from the street as ground level was actually the 3rd floor. Below it were 2 more sublevels and a basement, connected by a narrow enclosed stairwell. The interior lighting system had failed entirely, and outside the beam of my torch, visibility dropped to 0. This was not unusual for post-fire inspections by any means, but it was definitely eerie down here. Anyway, as I descended, the stairwell structure shifted sort of intermittently under my weight. The sound of wood flexing echoed in the confined space, and no other noise was present. I reached the first sub-level without incident and continued downward. About halfway between the next landing and the basement level, though, was when I heard a voice. It was male, calm and clearly articulated. It said, "You need to stop." The sound did not echo. It didn't sound distant or distorted or anything. It was positioned directly below me, coming from the stairwell itself. I paused and assumed briefly that another responder had entered the building without my knowledge. I announced myself and swept the stairwell with my torch. The next landing was beyond the effective range of the light, and I couldn't detect any movement. So I took one additional step. The voice instantly repeated itself, louder and closer this time. The tone was firm but not aggressive, and the wording was unchanged. At that point, physiological stress responses kicked in for me for sure. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, and difficulty focusing visually. I didn't perceive the panic at first, but I did recognize that continuing downward alone was no longer really appropriate. I turned and ascended slowly, maintaining visual contact with each step. I didn't hear the voice again. Once outside, I documented the lower levels as inaccessible due to insufficient visibility and potential structural instability. I didn't include the auditory experience in the official report, obviously, but several days later, the building was scheduled for demolition. Prior to the teardown, a search team conducted a full sweep of the basement using thermal imaging, even some cadaver dogs, and manual inspection as well, but nothing was found and no human remains were there. No evidence of unauthorized entry was identified either. There were no recorded missing persons associated with the site, and I have reviewed that incident many times since then. Maybe I was just tired and stressed. I mean, I had been at the job for some time by that point. But what remains difficult to reconcile is the clarity of the voice, and the way that it responded directly to my movement even, and also the fact that, while I personally did not hear any screams, I had a colleague who said that he did. I don't know. I really don't know what to make of the experience, and the whole place got torn down in the end, so I didn't really get a chance to go back and, well, take a look around. So I had spent most of the day hiking alone and returned to my vehicle shortly after dusk. Light rain had started and visibility dropped quickly once the sun went down, but by the time that I reached the road it was fully dark, and the tree cover made it even darker still. I am pretty familiar with wildlife in this region that I live in, and over the years I've encountered wild boar, foxes, feral dogs, deer, and once a lynx at a distance. I'm not trained in zoology or anything, but I've spent enough time outdoors to distinguish between animals behaving normally and something being wrong. Now, as I pulled out onto the road, I noticed headlights approaching from the right. The road surface is uneven and badly maintained there, so I hesitated to pull out quickly in case it was a ranger or forestry vehicle or something. A pickup truck passed in front of me, and it was a newer model, red, local plates. I followed behind at a safe distance, relieved that whoever was driving knew the road and wasn't crawling along. But about a mile ahead, after a shallow incline that levels out near a bend, the truck's brake lights sort of flashed once and then again, and then it slowed to a full stop. I stopped behind it, assuming that there was an animal on the road or debris from the storm or something. On the right shoulder, something was moving. At first glance, it looked like a person sort of bent forward, swaying slightly. The movement wasn't consistent with wind or an animal walking on four legs. The driver in the truck leaned toward his window, likely trying to see better. And what happened next was sudden and aggressive. A long object, possibly a stick or a pole or something, was swung hard into the side of the truck. I heard the impact clearly. The object struck the door and the side mirror area, and the truck immediately accelerated, fishtailing briefly on the uneven surface before regaining control and disappearing around the bend. At that point, I turned on my high beams. The figure, it was still there, but now closer to the road. It stood roughly chest height to the window of my car if upright, but its posture was hunched forward. It moved by shifting its weight rapidly, almost bouncing in place. This was no animal. I could see that it was wearing something bulky and sort of irregular over its upper body. The shape initially suggested an animal pelt or a thick jacket, but it didn't move naturally with the body underneath. The head covering obscured the outline of the face, but the face itself was visible. What unsettled me most was that the face, it didn't match the body size or the posture. It appeared older, human and disproportionate, with deep-set features. The eyes were visible, but didn't reflect light normally. The hands were not gloved in a standard way. They were small and appeared wrapped or bound in material, limiting finger movement. One held the same pole-like object used to strike the truck, and several rounded objects were attached near one end, which rattled when it was shaken. The figure stepped toward my vehicle and raised the object, shaking it close to my window without making contact. I heard a muttering or a low sort of vocalization, but I couldn't distinguish any words. But the behavior was deliberate and directed. I did not stop to assess any further as well. I reversed just enough to angle away and then accelerated past the figure while maintaining distance. Thankfully, it didn't pursue me. Now, I wasn't too scared in the moment, but I definitely experienced a strong psychological response afterward. What I mean is that I certainly had some adrenaline running through my veins at the time. I repeated the sequence of events out loud while driving to prevent memory distortion, but in the days following I considered other explanations, like wildlife, but that doesn't behave that way, and maybe it was a prank. Unlikely given the location, the timing, and the risk involved. A person with severe mental illness or someone attempting roadside intimidation is possible, but the coordination and the confidence displayed suggested planning and some familiarity with the area at the very least. I later reported the incident to local authorities, and they confirmed that no patrols were active on that road at that time. No similar reports were filed, though they acknowledged occasional issues with individuals living illegally in remote park areas. So I guess that might be an explanation. Still though, I don't think it was a homeless person. In fact, whatever this thing was, I really don't think that it was human. The house that this took place in was built in the 1980s and had been rented by my family for several years without any previous issues. The layout is pretty relevant. 2 bedrooms connected by a narrow hallway, with the living room and the kitchen at the opposite end. Also, sound carries easily through the doors, especially at night. Now, my father worked night shifts at the time, and on weekdays it was pretty common for my mother and me to stay up later than usual, watching television quietly to avoid disturbing the neighbors. On this particular night, we were watching a serialized crime drama or something like that. We checked the time before turning it off. It was shortly after 12:40 in the morning, and I went to my bedroom first. My son was already asleep against the wall, and our dog, a mixed breed, medium-sized male named Koda, was lying near the foot of the bed at this point. I tried to move slowly to avoid waking either of them. I lay down on my side and pulled the blanket over my legs, and I closed my eyes. I wasn't fully asleep when I heard my door open, and what caught my attention immediately was the voice. I heard my mother calling my name, urgently from close range. The way that she was speaking to me suggested that something was wrong, and before I could respond verbally, I felt pressure on my upper arm, followed by a pull strong enough to shift my torso upward. The movement was abrupt and not gradual. I sat up instinctively and opened my eyes. But the room was unchanged. The door was closed, and nobody was standing near the bed. Coda was no longer lying down. He was upright, body stiff, facing the door, producing a low, continuous growl. He didn't bark or move forward. He remained fixed in place, watching the door as if tracking something stationary. I stayed seated for several minutes, waiting for my mother to call again or enter the room, but nothing happened. Eventually, the dog settled, though he remained alert longer than usual. I didn't wake my son, and I didn't mention the incident the next morning either. I assumed it was a partial dream or maybe a stress response. The following night, the circumstances repeated in a way that made that explanation less convincing, though. So again, my father was working and my mother and I stayed up late, later than the night before, watching television until about 2 in the morning. This time my son was sleeping in his own room, only the dog was with me, and I lay down facing the mattress, hands near my head. Coda was asleep near the headboard, and I remember consciously noting just how quiet the house felt. Less than 10 seconds after closing my eyes, though, I heard movement at the door. The door opened inward, and I heard my mother calling my sister's name and not mine. Her voice sounded close, as if she was standing beside the bed, and as she spoke, the voice changed. The words became distorted in pitch and pacing, as if several recordings were overlapping slightly out of sync. I felt the blanket being pulled downward, then something took hold of my foot and lifted it several inches off the mattress. The grip was firm and localized around my ankle. I did not move immediately. My heart rate increased sharply, and I felt a cold sensation along the exposed skin where I was being touched. The blanket was suddenly pulled up to mid-calf, and I could feel air on my foot. It was now that Coda reacted violently. He stood, turned toward the foot of the bed, and growled louder than the previous night. His posture suggested threat, not confusion. He didn't approach the area, but he certainly didn't retreat either. When I finally pulled my leg back and turned over, there was nothing visible in the room. The door was open this time. The hallway light was off, but as far as I could tell, nobody was awake. I didn't sleep again that night, and the next morning my mother told me that she had experienced intense nightmares on both nights, involving somebody entering the house and standing over her bed. She said that she had woken up feeling watched, and I told her everything at that point that I had experienced, including the physical contact and the dog's behavior. We didn't contact anyone. I mean, there was nothing really to say, and the locks were intact. There was no forced entry. Nothing was missing. Also, we did check the carbon monoxide issues, and we later confirmed it was just normal air quality as far as we knew of. But after this, we adjusted our routines. Bedroom doors were locked at night, lights were left on in the hallway, and eventually, thankfully, the incidents stopped. I genuinely avoid talking about unusual experiences because they tend to get reduced to arguments about memory accuracy or personal bias and things of this nature. I work in a field where attention to detail really matters though, and I'm aware of just how unreliable recollection can be. That said, one incident from my previous job, it's never fit into any category that I'm comfortable dismissing outright. From 2011 to 2020, I worked as an administrative coordinator in an old place. It was a government building constructed in stages between the late 1800s and the early 1900s. The structure itself is massive and internally repetitive too. Long corridors, identical doorways, symmetrical stairwells, and enclosed bridges connecting separate wings. Each floor loops back on itself in ways that makes orientation difficult if you're sort of distracted as well. The building itself, though, is in constant use during business hours, but acoustically it behaves as if it's pretty much empty. Offices are sealed behind really thick doors, and you can walk an entire floor without hearing a voice or seeing any movement. It's not intimidating in a sort of dramatic way, but it does produce a bit of a persistent sense of isolation that most staff simply learn to ignore. Anyway, in March of 2018, I was assigned to deliver documents between two departments on the same level, room 4C17 and 4B02. The route required passing one of the main elevator banks at the far end of the west corridor. I remember reviewing the paperwork as I walked, moving slowly because there was no urgency. As I approached the elevators, I noticed a colleague standing near the call buttons. Her name was Elaine. We weren't close, but I did recognize her easily. She had worked on the same floor for years, and what stood out immediately was her appearance. She was wearing a formal outfit that was noticeably more polished than normal office attire. It registered as a bit unusual, but not alarming, I guess. I made brief eye contact, acknowledged her with a nod, and I said hello. She responded with a small wave. Her expression was neutral. She didn't speak. The elevator doors remained closed, and I continued walking, turning the corner toward my office and didn't think too much about it. Well, the following morning, the atmosphere in our department was noticeably different. Several staff members were gathered near the printer, speaking in hushed voices. I asked what was going on, and one of them asked me if I had heard about Elaine. I said that I hadn't, and that I had seen her the previous afternoon near the elevators. There was an immediate pause in the conversation. Somebody else then said that that wasn't possible. According to the information that had just been received, Elaine had died at home during the night 2 days earlier. Her absence hadn't been reported until her adult son contacted Human Resources that morning. I repeated what I had seen, though, assuming that there was some sort of a misunderstanding about the timing. The dates were checked, the timelines didn't change, and Elaine had not been in the building on the day that I had claimed to have seen her. She had already been deceased for over 24 hours by that point. I stopped discussing it, and I returned to my desk. Nobody accused me of lying, but it was clear that my account made people feel uncomfortable. I reviewed my schedule, my email timestamps, and the delivery log. I was in that corridor at the time that I remembered. There was no evidence that I was mistaken about the day either, and there were no security alerts and no unusual access records, no CCTV covering this section of the hall due to a long-standing camera outage in that area. Facilities, they confirmed that the elevators had been operational but logged no riders at that moment. After that, though, I became much more aware of just how often staff reported brief sightings, misplaced assumptions about who was present, or moments where people believed that they had passed someone who had later turned out to be absent or on leave that day. These incidents were always treated as just coincidence for the most part. I eventually left that job, and I don't describe the experience as supernatural, but I also don't categorize it as just benign either. And I guess what unsettles me the most is not that I might have been wrong, but that, given the circumstances, I really have no reliable explanation for how I could have been right. This took place in October of 2023 in a single-story rental house. I live there with my 3 children, and the house is pretty small, with thin internal walls, and we often sleep together in the main bedroom when the kids have trouble settling. Now, the first incident happened late one night while I was lying awake with all 3 children in bed. The lights were off and the house was quiet, but without warning, I felt a localized sensation along the back of my neck, similar to like static or maybe a light pressure combined with tingling. It was specific enough that I became aware of my posture immediately, and I didn't panic, but I certainly was alert. I shifted slightly, and then eventually I just sort of fell asleep. My sleep that night was pretty fragmented. Several times I became aware of movement sounds in the house, footsteps or weight shifting, without being fully awake. At about 3:30 in the morning, I woke to a strong smell, though, that I associated with food heating on a stove, possibly oil or maybe meat. The smell was concentrated and didn't resemble anything else in the house. I stayed in bed for several minutes, trying to determine whether the stove could have been left on or something. Eventually, the smell was strong enough that I got up to go and check, and the kitchen was cold. No burners were on. There was no residue or lingering odor elsewhere in the house, and I eventually returned to bed. Shortly after lying down again, I heard what sounded like a bedroom door closing with force, though. My son's room door was open when I had went to bed, and he was asleep beside me at the time. I checked the hallway, and all the doors were in their original positions. At that point, I assumed that I must have experienced like a partial dream state, and I didn't think too much about it again. Several days later, a second event occurred, though, when I was fully awake. So it was around 6 in the morning, and all 3 children were in bed with me. We were not asleep, and I heard the clear sound of one of the children climbing out of bed and running toward the bathroom. The sound was distinct enough that I turned immediately to see which child had moved, but all 3 were still beside me. At the same moment, my 4-year-old daughter sat upright and said that she had seen someone standing next to the bed watching us. She described the figure as a smaller version of herself and said that it ran away when she tried to reach it. I didn't prompt her or ask any leading questions, but when I asked what the person looked like, she repeated that it looked like me. I didn't pursue the conversation any further, and I didn't introduce any explanations to her. I assumed imagination or maybe a dream crossover. However, over the next 2 evenings, my daughter independently mentioned the same figure again. She said that it tried to talk to her while she was sleeping and attempted to get into bed with her as well. She pointed to the area near my pillow when asked where it stood. The final incident, though, happened the following afternoon. We left the house for errands for just under 2 hours, and when we returned, the central heater was set significantly higher than normal. None of the children could reach the controls, and I had not adjusted it before we left, so the system itself showed no fault codes or power interruptions or anything either. At that point, I documented the sequence of events and stopped speculating. I was uncomfortable with the repeated proximity of these incidents to my children mostly, and also to sleep-related transitions. Also, I have since ruled out gas leaks, carbon monoxide, electrical faults, and heating system malfunctions. I also limited exposure to media or discussions that could influence my daughter's descriptions. The report stopped without any intervention approximately 2 weeks later, and I haven't heard anything since then. So I work in field biology and behavioral research, and this incident stands out mostly because it occurred while I was fully alert, actively working, and corroborated by another person under the same conditions. So I was supervising a short-term nocturnal observation project involving a population of some mammals that exhibit peak activity after midnight. The site covered several square miles of managed bushland with limited infrastructure around. Aside from perimeter fencing and animal enclosures, there was a single service building used by staff for storage, data entry, and emergency shelter as well. Our work schedule was pretty consistent. 2-hour observation blocks beginning shortly before midnight. Lighting was restricted to filtered headlamps to avoid altering animal behavior. On the night in question, the first observation window concluded without incident. For the second block, one colleague, Mark, and I positioned ourselves near an elevated enclosure to monitor response patterns to visual stimuli. Within the first few minutes, animal behavior diverged from baseline. Instead of approaching the stimulus or vocalizing, the animals remained clustered near cover and showed minimal movement. This alone wasn't too alarming, but was definitely noted. About halfway through the observation window, I became aware of a sound that didn't align with environmental noise patterns here. It was tonal and repetitive, similar to breath-driving whistling or a single-note instrument. At first, I really didn't know what it was, but then the sound persisted and appeared to change in proximity without changing direction. I turned to Mark to confirm whether he was hearing it too, and before I could speak, he asked the same question. Neither of us could identify a source, too. The reserve is isolated, as I mentioned, and access was restricted at night. There were no vehicles scheduled, and the nearest road is like over 300 meters away, separated by dense vegetation that normally dampens sound. Shortly after this confirmation, though, I heard a separate sound. It was distinct from the tonal sound that I had heard before, but it was quiet and directional, coming from behind and slightly to my left. It sounded a lot like somebody saying, "Come here." The words were not shouted or projected. They were delivered as if someone was standing nearby and speaking at a normal volume. I didn't see anyone. I also didn't respond. I also did not tell Mark immediately because I was attempting to rule out internal causes before introducing any bias. Within seconds, though, Mark physically shifted closer to me and said that he felt like we were being watched. He didn't report hearing the speech, but he confirmed a strong sense of, presence, is how he put it. At that point, all the animal activity as well suddenly just completely ceased. The enclosure went silent, there was no movement, no calls. This was pretty abnormal for the species and the time window as well. The tonal sound stopped abruptly. We terminated the observation early and returned to the service building without discussion. Once inside, normal ambient noise resumed, and when I told Mark about the whispered phrase, he didn't dismiss it, but also didn't speculate. We documented the interruption as just an anomalous environmental event and reported it to the site management. We eventually did our due diligence as well, and no equipment malfunction was identified, no unauthorized access was recorded. Subsequent nights produced no similar events, and the animal behavior returned to baseline. And so I still have not drawn any conclusions about what exactly I think caused those sounds. I'm sharing this now because, well, enough time has passed that I can separate what happened from what it felt like at the time. So in late 2016, my family moved into a weatherboard farmhouse. The property sat on a rise several kilometers from town, surrounded by unmanaged scrub and some farmland. There were no adjacent houses within sight or hearing distance too. The building itself was dated to the early 1900s, though records were pretty vague. We later learned that it had been vacant for several years before we leased it. From the first week, the house felt difficult to settle into as well. Not frightening, but just sort of unsettling, I guess. Conversations tended to stop without obvious reason. Sleeping patterns were pretty inconsistent across the household. At the time, we attributed this to relocation stress and the isolation too. The initial disturbances, they were pretty minor and non-specific. Like at night, there were intermittent sounds that resembled light tapping or pressure against internal walls. Occasionally, there were single impacts like doors shifting, objects making contact with surfaces without obvious cause, and these were never loud enough to justify alarm and were consistent with an old structure exposed to temperature changes and wildlife and all that. The driveway was compacted gravel extending maybe about 40 meters from the main road. On multiple nights, different family members independently reported hearing what sounded like footsteps progressing along the driveway toward the house. The cadence was slow and deliberate, not consistent with an animal's or vehicle's, obviously, and each time, exterior lights were checked and nobody was ever there. No tracks were found the following morning, and it was weird. Inside the house, too, small inconsistencies became pretty common. Cupboard doors were left ajar, drawers partially opened, items relocated short distances without anyone recalling moving them. None of these incidents were significant alone, but what made them notable was frequency and distribution. No single person was responsible, of that we were very much convinced, and the events were noticed by everyone without prompting. And then, within about 2 months, auditory experiences escalated too. At first, it sounded like speech filtered through walls, as if someone were talking in another room. Later, several of us heard whispers close enough to register direction but not origin. On at least 2 occasions, I heard a voice say, "Come here," from behind me while I was alone in the house. Each time the sound was brief, quiet, and conversational in tone, I would say, and there was no one ever present. Visual anomalies followed too. Peripheral movement without a visible source, dark shapes crossing hallways that resolved into nothing when directly observed. I personally assumed that I was just tired and seeing things, but we had dogs on our property as well, small terriers, and occasionally heard growling that we assumed was theirs, but over time it became clear that some of the sounds just didn't match their vocal range. The dogs, they would often react by freezing or staring toward interior corridors without barking. And in early 2017, I recorded a short video in my bedroom during daylight hours. When reviewing it later, a human-shaped silhouette passed behind the window line and disappeared from view. The weather conditions that day made an exterior explanation very unlikely too, and nobody else was on that property. The footage, it was still inconclusive, but definitely unsettling due to the timing and all that. It was at this point too that physical marks began appearing on my legs and on my arms, linear scratches, spaced too widely to match our cats or anything else. Mind you as well, they appeared literally overnight and were not accompanied by pain at the time that they occurred or anything. The layout of the house amplified everything too. From the living area, a long hallway connected the kitchen to an external garage, and on several nights, both I and visiting friends observed a figure move through the hallway at a normal walking pace. Mind you, this was not like those peripheral ones. It was not a shadow flicker or a reflection or anything too. It appeared consistent in shape and speed, and it didn't seem to react to the observation too. My bedroom was located in a sort of converted undercroft beneath the main structure, accessible only from the outside, and from that space I regularly heard movement above me that didn't correspond to foot traffic pattern upstairs. Voices were occasionally audible, but when checked, nobody had been speaking. Later too, we noticed that multiple bedrooms, including mine and the ones directly above, shared periods of intense discomfort. What I mean is that your breathing felt strained, sleep was just really disrupted. These sensations were always localized and never affected the entire house, which was really weird. My mother, she personally disliked the property from the outset. She avoided being there alone when possible, and on one occasion when she stayed overnight by herself, she experienced a prolonged episode of sleep paralysis or something. She reported seeing a tall, thin figure standing in the hallway watching her. She was unable to move or speak, and described a strong sense of awareness coming from the figure. After that, she refused to stay alone in the house ever again. The day that we vacated the property too, we conducted a final inspection beneath the house near the water system, and it was then through an access panel that we found markings on the ground, like geometric shapes drawn into the dirt, and several heavily used candles arranged around them. The wax was old and hardened, and no one in the household had been aware of this area previously. In fact, it was kind of a miracle that we even found it at that point. Only then, though, did we recall the real estate agent mentioning reports of trespassers during the vacancy period. Further into the bushland, about 200 meters away from the house, objects had been arranged between rocks, like dolls and deteriorated paper materials and things like this. The authorities were notified, but nothing actionable was ever found. During the time that we lived there, 6 pets total died under unrelated but really unusual circumstances. This didn't continue after we moved as well. We left that property in mid-2018, and since then, we've lived in a newly constructed home. No similar events have occurred, no disturbances, no behavioral changes, and no unexplained sounds. And really, it's the contrast of being in a new place that makes thinking back on that old place just so much worse. I personally didn't hear this story until years after it happened, and by then the details had settled into something that he could recount without emotion. And I think that that's what made it so much more unsettling. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He was explaining something that had never fit into the rest of his life. So, in 2011, when he was 16, my parents sent him to stay with some extended family, partly to remove him from escalating local violence and partly because he had already started drinking heavily. He lived with our grandmother in a small concrete house on the edge of town. There were no nearby neighbors and no real separation between sleeping areas, just sort of doors and thin walls. According to him, most nights followed the same pattern. He would come home late, intoxicated, and pass out fully clothed. But one night in particular stands out because he's almost got no memory of returning home at all. The first thing that he recalls is lying on his bed and noticing that the room felt wrong, quiet in a way that didn't match the house. He thought that he had heard the door open and close, and when he tried to sit up, he became really disoriented and assumed the alcohol had hit him harder than usual. He attempted to stand, but the sensation under him didn't match the expected movement. He later described it as realizing that the bed wasn't supported the way that it should have been. At that point, he noticed something in his peripheral vision too. When he turned his head, he reported seeing a large figure occupying the space near the foot of the bed. He described it in physical terms, height, mass, and color, but when pressed later, he admitted that the details were hard to separate from the panic. What mattered to him, though, was the scale. It didn't make sense relative to the room. He didn't initially realize that he was shouting, but he became aware of it only when our grandmother entered the room. She was physically small and elderly, but he remembers her voice cutting through everything else, and she spoke directly toward the space where he perceived the figure and ordered this thing, whatever it was, to leave. He says the moment that she did, the pressure in the room changed, and whatever he had been focusing on was no longer there anymore. Only then did he realize that the bed had lowered back into place, and when he tried to get up, she stopped him and instructed him to stay still. She sat beside him and began reciting prayers aloud. He doesn't remember falling asleep and only waking up late the next morning feeling physically exhausted and unusually calm. That incident, though, wasn't the only one, because several weeks later, he woke up with the sensation of being pulled by his ankles. This time he described being partially conscious, aware of the room layout, but unable to move normally. He believed that something was dragging him toward the doorway. Near the doorframe was a small wooden cross that had been hanging there for years, and he reached out, grabbed it, and held it up in desperation. And he says that the sensation stopped abruptly. He became fully aware again on the floor just outside of his bedroom, and at the time he assumed that it had been a dream until somebody else mentioned it, because a family friend who had been sleeping in the adjacent room that night, when I later spoke to him, he described waking up and being unable to move while watching my brother being pulled across the floor. He said that he tried to shout but couldn't, and he remembers mentally urging him to grab the cross, but my brother says that he never heard him. Over time, though, his night disturbances decreased and he stopped drinking as heavily. He stopped talking about reoccurring dreams involving threatening figures, something that he admitted had been common throughout his childhood. We don't really discuss it now anymore either, not because it frightens him or me or anything, but because there is nothing really useful to add to what we've spoken about over the years. And honestly, if it wasn't for the testimony of that friend, I would probably think of this as just severe alcohol-induced sleep paralysis or something. It's the fact that at least 2 people remember being awake, aware, and one was unable to intervene while the other was, and the fact that I also confirmed them as witnesses to these things, that has always made me think that there was something more to this. I didn't think much about this incident for years because, well, at the time it felt like something that we had simply stumbled into by accident, rather than something that was directed at us. It wasn't until I was older and better understood how remote that area actually was that I started reconsidering just how close we may have come to something dangerous. So this happened in late October of 2008 when I was about 15 years old. I lived in a pretty rural area where large stretches of protected scrubland sit between farmland and river systems. Some of it is managed conservation land, and while there are marked walking tracks, locals were known for often cutting across unofficial paths. Now, a friend of mine and I used to explore those areas pretty regularly, but we weren't looking for anything specific, mostly just old fence lines, abandoned equipment, or remnants of earlier properties that had been cleared decades earlier. It was common for teenagers there to wander well beyond the official trails. And on that day, we had started walking mid-afternoon. By the time that we moved off the marked track, the light was already beginning to drop. We were probably about 90 minutes from where we had parked, and we came across a clearing that neither of us really remembered seeing before. It wasn't a natural open space, too. The ground had clearly been disturbed here, and near the center was an old utility vehicle parked at a sort of angle, partially concealed by some low scrub. That alone was obviously pretty unusual. Vehicles, they weren't permitted in that area without specific authorization, and access points were pretty limited too. 2 men were standing near the rear of the vehicle though. One had a shovel in his hands and there was a mound freshly turned soil beside them. From our position, we could see that they had already dug a hole of significant depth. There was a brief moment where both sides sort of noticed each other at the same time, and nobody spoke, and neither group approached. Then both men moved quickly toward the vehicle. They entered it almost immediately and drove straight toward the tree line where we were standing. We reacted without discussion and ran back into the thicker vegetation. The terrain there was terribly uneven, and the visibility dropped to almost nothing once you left the open ground. We moved until we found a dense tangle of fallen branches and positioned ourselves inside of it, trying to remain completely still. We heard the vehicle stop near the edge of the clearing. A short time later, we heard the doors open and close. Voices followed, first indistinct and then clearly they were searching. At one point, we could hear one of them moving through the brush in our general direction too. We also heard dogs barking. Whether they were actually present or simply being referred to, we couldn't really tell, but the sound was close enough to cause concern. One of the men shouted that he could hear movement as well, and we literally stopped breathing normally and we just tried to remain as silent as we could. We didn't move for several minutes, even after the sound shifted further away. Eventually, the engine started again and we listened until the vehicle noise faded completely. Only then did we begin retracing our route back toward where we had left our car. We didn't speak during the walk back or during the drive home. The primary concern at that point wasn't what they had been doing, but it was whether they had seen enough of us to identify us for something later. At the time, we speculated about possibilities in very simplistic terms. The most obvious assumption was that they were disposing of something that they didn't want discovered. As I got older, though, I realized that there were multiple more plausible explanations, like illegal dumping, concealed storage, or even some unauthorized excavation of materials out there. What remains difficult to rationalize, though, is their immediate reaction to our presence. They didn't attempt to explain what they were doing, or even try to tell us to leave or anything. Their response was immediate pursuit. Years later, when I reviewed maps of that conservation zone, I realized just how isolated that particular clearing was. It wasn't near any access roads, and the only way to reach it with a vehicle would have required prior knowledge of old service tracks no longer officially maintained. I still live in the same region. It's entirely possible that I have crossed paths with those men since then in ordinary public settings without recognizing them. But what continues to stand out to me isn't the digging itself, it's just how quickly the situation shifted from a silent encounter to active pursuit like that, and how certain they seemed that they needed to prevent us from staying there long enough to observe whatever they were doing. Back in 2019, when I was about 14 years old, my father was working long-haul freight routes, and during school holidays, I occasionally traveled with him. His runs were tightly scheduled, so when we stopped earlier in the day, it usually meant that he had reached his legal driving limit and had to remain parked overnight. That afternoon, we pulled into a roadside stop. It wasn't a large facility, but just a sort of wide gravel lot, divided between heavy vehicles and smaller cars, a few shaded tables there and some basic amenities. There were no buildings though nearby and no staff present or anything. We arrived shortly after 4:30. The temperature was still pretty high, typical for that time of the year, and the first thing that I noticed after stepping out of the cab was an unusually strong odor. At the time, I assumed it was something related to the toilets or possibly spoiled food left in bins. It was unpleasant, but not something that immediately signaled anything specific. We parked facing the section designated for passenger vehicles. About 40 to 50 meters away, there was an older utility vehicle parked by itself. It appeared to have been there for some time. Dust had settled on it, and there was no sign of movement inside. We stayed inside the truck while my father completed his logbook and prepared his overnight paperwork. The smell, though, continued intermittently, and especially when the wind shifted. Well, after roughly an hour, a marked police vehicle arrived. 2 officers exited and walked directly toward the parked utility vehicle without surveying the rest of the area first, which suggested that they already knew why they were there, and from our position, we could see them circle the vehicle and sort of speak briefly to each other. One officer approached the driver's side window and then stepped back almost immediately. The other retrieved something from the patrol car that looked like gloves. They did not attempt to open the vehicle immediately, though. Instead, they waited near their car for about 20 minutes. A second vehicle arrived later, which I now recognize was a contracted forensic transport van. 2 individuals wearing protective clothing exited and went directly to the parked utility vehicle. From where we were, visibility was pretty limited, but it was clear that they opened the vehicle and had begun working inside it for several minutes before bringing out a covered stretcher. It was at that point that it became obvious that a deceased person had been inside the vehicle for some time. The sequence, it was handled quietly and efficiently. No announcements were made and the rest area was never closed. Other travelers continued arriving and leaving without being aware of what was happening. The entire process, from the arrival of the forensic transport to their departure, it took less than 30 minutes. After they left, the police remained briefly to complete documentation, and then they also departed. The vehicle itself was removed shortly afterward by a tow operator who had arrived near dusk. Neither my father nor I approached anyone or asked any questions at the time. From a distance, the most likely explanation appeared to be exposure-related death, given the conditions and the fact that the vehicle had been stationary in direct heat for an extended period of time. But what has stayed with me over all this time isn't the site itself, but the timeline, really. You see, when we arrived, the vehicle was already present, and the odor had clearly developed to a noticeable level. That indicates that the individual had likely been there for many hours at least, possibly longer, without anyone intervening. It also means that during the time that we were parked there, nearly 2 hours, multiple people passed through that rest area without recognizing what had even happened. In the years since then, I have attempted to locate any public record or news mention corresponding to the time frame and location, but I just haven't found anything definitive. And so what remains really unsettling is realizing just how easily something severe can occur in an isolated, true but publicly accessible place, and how long it can remain unnoticed simply because everyone assumes that someone else will notice first. So I had been transporting an older neighbor home after she was discharged from a medical clinic following a bit of a minor injury. She lived alone, so I agreed to make sure that she got back safely and settled in. Her apartment, it was located on the far side of an industrial corridor in my city. The route required driving through an area that is sparsely populated at night, mostly warehouses, closed storefronts, and some low traffic volume after business hours. It's not considered high crime there by any means, but it does have a bit of a history of transient activity and occasional disturbances. Anyway, traffic conditions were pretty minimal. We encountered only a few vehicles during the entire drive back. About 5 minutes from her building, we stopped at a signalized intersection. The light cycle at this particular junction is pretty long as well, and we were stationary for what I probably estimate is about 45 seconds before the event began. So while waiting, I observed a pedestrian entering the crosswalk from the left side. His appearance did not initially suggest anything unusual. He was dressed in ordinary clothing, jeans, neutral-colored shirt, no visible signs of intoxication such as unsteady movement or anything. However, his behavior deviated from normal crossing patterns for sure. Instead of continuing across the road, he stopped directly in front of the vehicle and faced us. He maintained eye contact with the interior of the car rather than scanning for traffic or moving forward. My passenger spoke first, stating that she felt uncomfortable with the situation. That comment aligned with my own assessment too, that his actions were atypical for someone simply crossing the street like that. The individual, though, then began gesturing aggressively, pointing repeatedly toward the windshield and moving his arms in really abrupt motions. Although we could not hear him due to the closed windows and the radio being on, his mouth movement indicated that he was speaking loudly or shouting and was being aggressive. This continued for about 10 to 15 seconds. At that stage, I shifted my foot toward the accelerator in preparation to leave if necessary, but I didn't move because the traffic signal remained red and I didn't want to create additional risk unless escalation occurred. But the escalation did occur, and very abruptly. Without warning, he moved from the front of the vehicle to the passenger side in a rapid sprint. His movement was coordinated and purposeful rather than erratic, and he reached the passenger door and attempted to open it immediately, pulling the handle multiple times in quick succession. Thankfully, the door was locked. But then, he struck the window with an open hand while leaning close enough to look directly inside of the vehicle. At that point, I evaluated the situation as a potential attempted entry rather than just random agitation, and so I proceeded through the red signal after confirming that there was no cross-traffic. The maneuver was controlled rather than evasive, but I executed without any delay. As we accelerated away, I observed the individual in the rearview mirror running along the roadway in our direction for several seconds before eventually stopping. He didn't pursue further once we gained that distance. We altered our route afterward, taking indirect streets to reach her residence, and once inside of her apartment, she was pretty freaked out, understandably so to be honest, shaking and difficulty settling. This was noticeable as well because she had remained relatively composed during the event itself. Personally, I documented the incident and later filed a non-emergency police report, primarily just to establish a record since the individual's actions constituted attempted forced entry into a vehicle at an intersection, mind you. And while I have not seen this guy again and there was no follow-up communication regarding the report, and while the incident itself was brief, I would say less than a minute in total duration, it demonstrated just how quickly a routine situation can change into a direct threat scenario like this, in what was really an otherwise ordinary setting. In late winter of 1998, when I was 16, I was traveling back toward my home state after leaving it months earlier. I wasn't alone, too. Two other teenagers were also moving between cities without stable housing and were traveling with me. We had access to an older van and were driving long distances in short bursts, stopping wherever we could rest. On the evening in question, we had pulled into a small roadside rest area along a rural interstate in western Idaho. Snow conditionings were worsening and the visibility was deteriorating quickly. We stayed parked for roughly half an hour while we waited for the storm intensity to ease a little bit, and when we left, the snowfall had not improved very much. The roadway leading back to the interstate was partially obscured by accumulation and blowing snow. Within a few minutes of leaving the rest area, though, I noticed a figure standing along the shoulder ahead. As we approached, it became clear that it was an adult male holding a very young child. The child was dressed in winter clothing and didn't appear to have anything wrong with him. My immediate assumption was that this adult had experienced a vehicle breakdown or something and was attempting to get assistance. Now, given the weather conditions and the presence of a child, we decided to stop. The man entered the front passenger seat while holding the child on his lap, and he didn't ask permission before sitting down, nor did he introduce himself or provide any explanation about how he had even ended up there. He also didn't really seem to initially notice that two other teenagers, older ones, were seated behind him. Once he realized that they were present, though, his demeanor changed. He became visibly tense and began speaking rapidly and without clear structure. The content of his speech focused on unrelated topics, primarily about purchasing recreational equipment in inland states because of lower prices or something. His tone was unusually intense, though, and very repetitive, too. The conversation, it didn't follow normal social patterns, is what I'm trying to say. He didn't respond directly to questions and didn't ask any himself. The child's behavior was equally unusual, too. Throughout the entire interaction, the child remained completely still. He didn't cry, speak, or even attempt to engage with anyone in the vehicle. He didn't look toward the adults for reassurance or anything, which would typically be expected in a stressful situation involving strangers. Instead, he just stared downward continuously. He also showed no reaction to subtle vehicle movements or loud conversation or anything. We drove for maybe about 15 minutes before the man requested to be dropped off at a fuel station in a small town along the route that we were going. He exited quickly without further discussion and walked away while still holding the child. At the time, I didn't pursue the situation any further. My primary focus was getting through the trip safely in all this poor weather. But years later, as an adult, I began reviewing past events from that period of my life more critically, and I had become interested in cold cases and missing persons in investigations, which led me to reconsider that encounter a little bit. And several aspects began to stand out upon reflection. First, the man never indicated where he had come from or why he was walking in severe weather conditions with a small child. There had been no visible vehicles nearby either, which means that either he was walking for quite some time, or there was no vehicle. Second, the child's lack of movement and complete silence over an extended period was not consistent with normal behavior for a child of that apparent age. Third, the adult's conversational patterns suggested significant psychological instability, or at the very least, extreme stress. Now, while researching historical missing persons reports from that region in that time frame, I did find a case involving a young child reported missing within days of when this encounter occurred. The physical description of the child's clothing, it closely resembled what I remembered too. I eventually contacted investigators to provide a statement, and they confirmed one detail that I provided relating to clothing design had not been publicly released, and so they wanted to organize more time to sit down and talk. No definitive confirmation was ever given to me regarding whether the individual that I had encountered was connected to that case, and the investigators stated that due to the passage of time and the lack of additional evidence that they could neither confirm or rule it out either. That encounter too lasted less than 20 minutes, I would say, but the implications of it only became clear decades later when viewed through a more informed perspective, I guess you could say. I wasn't really someone who worried about personal security before this happened. I had lived alone in a small upstairs unit of a 4-apartment building for several years without any prior incidents. The neighborhood, it had a low crime rate too, and there was limited through traffic, and access to my unit required climbing an exterior stairway that was visible from the street. So, because of these factors, I had developed a bit of a routine assumption that opportunistic intrusions were very unlikely. Now, this took place in late autumn of 2024, so not that long ago. I'd gone to bed earlier than usual that night, sometime before 10 p.m, and as part of my normal routine, I closed and locked the main entry door and engaged the deadbolt. In hindsight, I think the bolt never really fully sat in the strike plate there, but there was no sign of forced entry later, which indicates that the door had been left technically unsecured, despite appearing locked, I think anyway. Anyway, at about 11 p.m, I woke abruptly to a bright white light directed at my face. My initial interpretation was that I had accidentally activated my own phone's flashlight, since I often kept my phone near me while sleeping. And that assumption lasted only a few seconds though, because during that same moment, I registered a pressure on the mattress beside me, and the distinct sensation of someone shifting their weight as if attempting to sit or lie down. As my vision adjusted, I realized that there was another person next to me in the bed. The individual appeared to be male, wearing dark clothing, including a hooded sweatshirt. He was holding a smartphone with a flashlight function turned on and was angling it toward me while looking down at the screen intermittently. I reacted verbally and moved to leave the bed immediately. Now, because I use a medical breathing device at night, the tubing caught and pulled the unit off the table as I tried to stand, and the device struck the floor, creating a loud noise. But weirdly, even this didn't appear to, alarm the intruder at all. I backed away from the bedroom while maintaining visual contact. The person didn't attempt to grab me or move quickly or anything. Instead, he followed at a very slow pace, and he was still focused partly on his phone. He repeatedly said short phrases such as "sorry" and "my mistake," but his tone did not match a genuine accidental entry scenario at all. The phrasing seemed calm and rehearsed rather than confused. In any case, I continued retreating toward the rear exit of the unit, which leads directly to the exterior stairway, and once outside I began shouting loudly for him to leave and to alert the neighbors. At that point, he stopped advancing and shifted his behavior. He adopted a casual posture and spoke in a sort of conversational tone, asking a single-word question implying that he had entered the wrong place. There was a brief moment when the phone light illuminated part of his face, and he appeared to be a young adult male with no immediately distinguishable marks visible under the lighting conditions. But after several seconds of standoff, he turned, descended the stairs at normal walking speed, and left the area. He didn't run or show any urgency, and I was focused on contacting emergency services, and I didn't track his direction of travel. A nearby resident heard me yelling and came outside to remain with me until the law enforcement arrived. Officers conducted a preliminary check of the building and surrounding area, but they didn't locate anyone matching the description. There was no evidence of forced entry, supporting the conclusion that the door had not been fully secured. Now, in reviewing the timeline afterward, I identified two prior interactions that, while not conclusively linked, now appear pretty relevant. So about 1 week earlier, a delivery driver who brought food into my unit displayed really unusual behavior. He stumbled repeatedly while approaching the door, collided against it several times, and ignored written instructions not to knock. There was a strong odor of alcohol, and his coordination was visibly impaired. That incident was reported to the delivery company at the time. A separate earlier observation involved a transient individual who had spent extended periods near the building months before the intrusion. He frequently remained in the driveway area, smoking and staring at residents. However, that person had not been seen recently, and there's no direct evidence connecting him to the break-in at all. But the most unsettling aspect of the incident is really the intruder's demeanor. He didn't behave like someone surprised to have entered the wrong residence. He also did not act like someone attempting immediate theft or anything. His actions indicated deliberate entry, controlled movement, and a willingness to approach an occupied bed while the resident was asleep, to the point where this guy had laid down next to me. Unfortunately, no suspect was ever identified, and there were no further attempts to access the unit after additional security measures were installed, including reinforced locking hardware and a door frame plate and some surveillance cameras. Now, from an analytical standpoint, the most probable explanation is that the individual tested multiple doors in the area until finding one that was not fully secured. The behavior suggests opportunistic targeting rather than prior familiarity with the specific unit. But I will say that, even though I know all this, the event had a very psychological impact on me. Sleeping disruption persisted for several weeks after this. Hypervigilance remained elevated for months, and although daily functioning eventually returned to baseline, the incident definitely changed how I saw things and made me far more alert and aware of just how important safety precautions really are. The practical conclusion to all of this is pretty straightforward. The intrusion, it didn't require specialized skills, planning, or forced entry or anything. It occurred because I was complacent and I wasn't checking the doors correctly. So in January of last year, I left my apartment in the early evening without, any really specific objective. The purpose was really simply to just get out of the building after being indoors most of the day. I chose to drive to a second-hand retail store located at the far end of an aging commercial strip in a suburban area outside of Cleveland, Ohio. Most of the adjacent businesses in that complex had already closed for the day, and lighting in the parking lot was pretty limited. When I entered the lot, I noticed immediately that the section near the store entrance had no available spaces. I proceeded slowly down the first driving lane, and As I approached the end of that row, a white four-door sedan abruptly cut across two empty accessible parking spaces and moved directly into my path. I braked to avoid contact. There was no horn use or visible reaction from the occupants. The sedan contained two adult women in the front seats. Neither made eye contact, but both appeared to be aware of my presence based on head orientation and body posture. I continued driving and moved to an adjacent row that was largely empty due to the surrounding businesses being closed. I parked near the middle of that open section, and after turning off my engine, I opened the driver's door and began preparing to exit. At that point, the same white sedan reappeared suddenly. It had circled the lot and had now positioned itself directly in front of my vehicle at a sort of shallow angle, partially obstructing the walking path between my car and the direction of the store entrance. I remained partially seated for several seconds under the pretense of adjusting my coat zipper. In reality, though, I was observing the occupants. They didn't speak or gesture toward me, but they also didn't resume normal behavior as well. The car remained idling and stationary. The sedan then moved forward approximately maybe a car's length, but still stayed positioned in a way that limited a direct walking route toward the store. And it was at that moment that I heard footsteps from behind me, which was unexpected because the area behind my vehicle bordered a tree line with accumulated snowbanks. I turned, though, and observed an adult male, maybe about 10 to 15 meters away, walking directly toward me. He wasn't moving along a defined pedestrian path and appeared to have come from the wooded edge of the property rather than from the parking lot entrances. His direction of travel was not aligned with the store or any visible destination. There was no verbal interaction, and he didn't call out or signal in any way. His pace was steady, though, and direct. At that point, I reassessed the situation. There was no reason that I needed to enter that store, and remaining outside the vehicle would have required walking between the sedan and the approaching individual. So I immediately re-entered my car, locked the doors, started the engine, and exited the parking lot without delay. While leaving, though, I observed through the mirror that the white sedan remained stationary and didn't attempt to follow or anything. Now, there was no definitive evidence that the individuals were acting in coordination, but several factors were inconsistent with routine parking behavior, that much was clear. The initial vehicle maneuver that cut across the accessible spaces, well, that was weird. The repeated repositioning near my car without a clear purpose, and the presence of a pedestrian emerging from, well, pretty much out of nowhere, an area not typically used for foot traffic at all. That was weird too. From a situational awareness perspective, I'm pretty sure that this was a setup. Whether the intent was confrontation, theft, or, well, I really do not want to think about that. So I lived on this property between mid-2003 and early 2006. My mother had separated from my father and had moved us into my grandfather's rural property. It was a working horse property with several paddocks, outbuildings, and two older story houses that had been modified over time rather than built as a single plan. When we moved in, the bedroom allocation was not random too. My grandmother offered my mother a choice between two upstairs rooms on the western side of the house, and so my mother chose the larger one for herself and assigned me the smaller adjacent room. Years later, she told me that she regretted that decision because she had always felt uncomfortable about that specific room, although she never explained that to me at that time. The layout is pretty relevant too to this place. So my bedroom shared a wall with a narrow storage attic that had been converted from unused roof space. Access to that attic was through a lightweight interior door located inside of my room. The attic itself had no lighting, no windows, and minimal insulation. It was essentially just a crawl space large enough to walk through while hunched. And during the few months there, nothing unusual really occurred during the day. The issues were always limited to nighttime. I repeatedly heard a sound that I initially interpreted as an infant crying at a distance. The sound was faint, irregular, and didn't appear to originate from a consistent direction. It didn't resemble animals that I was familiar with at that age, and when I asked my grandmother about it, she attributed it to livestock from neighboring properties, specifically goats. That explanation was plausible enough in a rural setting for me, so I accepted it. Over time, additional minor anomalies occurred though. The most frequent involved my radio. I would leave it turned to a specific station before school, and when I returned home, it would sometimes be set to a static or an entirely different frequency. I asked each family member whether they had entered my room, and all consistently denied doing so. There were no signs of forced entry or disturbance, and I even hid it at one point to try and see if I could stop it, but it never did. Another reoccurring issue involved a bedside lamp with a manual switch. On multiple mornings, I woke up to find it turned on, despite having no recollection of activating it during the night. At that age, I assumed I might have been turning it on unconsciously while sort of half asleep or something. But the situation, it escalated when the attic door began opening intermittently. The door, it didn't latch securely due to age and warping, but it did not open freely under normal conditions either. Several times I left it closed before bed and found it partially open later. This created enough anxiety that my grandfather eventually installed a simple sliding latch on my side of the door to keep it secured. Separately from my experiences though, my grandmother observed something unusual involving my grandfather too. One morning she saw him walking across a pasture carrying a water bucket while appearing to converse with someone beside him. When he returned inside, she asked who he had been talking to, and he initially answered that he had been speaking with a man that he referred to by name, then immediately corrected himself and laughed, stating that he must have imagined it because no one had actually been present. That was obviously very weird, and she never knew what to make of it. About a year after we moved in, though, a separate discovery occurred in one of the paddocks. The horses frequently congregated under a single tree for shade there, and over time their movement eroded the topsoil in that area, and this exposed several stone markers that turned out to be old grave markers. The property had previously contained a small family burial site that had been partially cleared decades earlier before the land was sold. Records later confirmed that at least 2 of the graves were associated with deaths during childbirth in the early 20th century. We also learned that an abandoned barn on a neighboring parcel had been the site of a suicide about 60 years before we had moved in. This information came from a longtime local resident rather than any official documentation, but the person was trusted and pretty believable, to be honest. Now, one of the more unsettling experiences occurred on a school bus, believe it or not. Because of the rural location, I was normally the first passenger picked up in the morning. On one occasion, due to a temporary route change, another student was already on board when I entered, and he initiated conversation and stated that his family had apparently previously lived on the same property where I was currently residing. After discussing the property briefly, he asked which bedroom that I occupied, and when I described its location, he paused and then asked whether anything unusual happened there at night. At that age, I did not provide any details, but his question made it clear that he associated that specific room with something noteworthy. In any case, we moved away several years later when my mother relocated for employment, and after leaving that house, I did not experience similar occurrences in any subsequent residence. It's weird though looking back on it all, from the child's crying at nighttime to the door opening by itself, and even just the eerie feeling that I had in that room from time to time. I don't know if something was actually going on in there, or maybe I was just lucky enough to avoid something, but that other kid's reaction when I told him that I was staying in that room, I will never forget it as long as I live.